All right, so before in the last section, we were talking about congruent figures. All right, now we're going to talk about specifically congruent triangles. All right, congruent triangles. Before, we had to show that if two triangles were congruent, that every single corresponding angle was congruent. So we had to show all of the angles were congruent. And then we had to show that all the corresponding sides were congruent. So there's a lot that we needed to show because we had to show that all these corresponding parts were equal or congruent to each other. Now there's a shortcut that we can use. There's 5 rules or 5 shortcuts that we can use that can make us answer these questions a little bit easier or a little bit more quicker, I guess you could say. And these are going to be theorems that we are using. Right? So there's 5 of them. And now we don't need to go through and show all of the corresponding angles and all of the corresponding sides are congruent or equal. If there's certain rules that we say or show that we can apply, then it guarantees that the two triangles would be congruent. All right, so we're going to talk about these different rules, and then we're going to go through some examples, and then that will be it for this video. All right, so the first one is side, side, side. So that means if we have two triangles, and all of our sides are congruent to each other, so the corresponding sides are congruent, then that means we don't have to go through and show that all the angles are congruent, that these two triangles are in fact congruent to each other. So if all 3 sides are congruent, then that means triangle ABC is congruent to triangle RST. And remember, the order matters. So pretty much in this first one, we go from A, so we go through 1 tick mark, through 2, through 3. So the other triangle, we need to go in the same direction. So that's why it's RST, because we're following the exact same order that we did for the first one. So now we don't have to show all the angles are congruent. If we can show that all 3 sides are congruent, then through the side, side, side postulate, we know 100% that they are congruent. All right, so that is the first one. Side, side, side. We're going to talk about these first. And then at the end, there's just going to be some problems that we'll go through and answer them all at once. All right, so we're not going to go through individual problems as we go. We're just going to wait to the end. All right, but the very first one is side, side, side. All right, so the first one we did was side, side, side. And now the second one is side, angle, side. Now this is very important. All right, it's side, angle, side. So when we're going through these, we follow the order that is written. So side, angle, side. Since this angle is between these 2 sides, with the way that we write it, the angle that's congruent has to be the angle that's between the 2 congruent sides. So what I mean by that is if this side is congruent to this side, and this angle is congruent to this angle, the only angle that we can guarantee that these 2 are congruent is the included angle or the angle in between. So it would have to be that these 2 angles are congruent. If we try to say, well, these 2 are congruent, or these 2 are congruent, it wouldn't work because these 2 blue angles I just drew are not between the 2 sides. Right? It's not included or between the 2 sides, but it's outside of it. It's after it. Right? So it's very important that when you are following these side, 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 and side, angle, side, and the other ones we're going to learn, that you are following exactly the way that they're written. So angle is between the 2 sides. So when we look at these figures, it has to be the angles between the 2 sides that are congruent in order for us to say 100% guaranteed that these 2 are congruent. All right, so here in this example, we have RS is congruent to UV, RT is congruent to UW, and since R and U are the angle that are between the 2 congruent sides, they must also be congruent, which they are. And that allows us to use the side, angle, side, and then we can say that the 2 triangles are congruent with our congruency statement. All right, so the way that we write this is extremely important. We're not just randomly writing the letters. The way that we write these side, 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 SSS and SAS, and the ones that we're going to follow next, it's very important with the way that it needs to appear on your figure. That is the key thing that you need to know with this. All right, it must follow the way that we write these side, angle, side, and side, 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 etc. All right, let's go through the next 2. All right, so we went through side, side, side. Side, angle, side, where we know that the angle needs to be the angle between the 2 congruent sides that are congruent to each other. So it has to be the included angle. Now this one is angle, side, angle. So just like we had to do with the side, angle, side, in this case, when we have 2 triangles, if we have two angles that are congruent, so let's just say this angle is congruent to this angle, and this angle is congruent to this angle, in order for us to use angle side angle, the side that's congruent must be the side that is between the two congruent angles. So this side must be congruent to this side, or else we cannot use this postulate. All right, so angle side angle, the side in between the two angles must be the one that is congruent. If I were to say that this angle is congruent to this angle, this side is congruent to this side, we can't use angle side angle because it's not the side in between the two angles. This is a different one that we're actually going to learn, but we can't use angle side angle. And the same thing, if this side is congruent to this side, we can't use angle side angle because these black tick marks, these sides, are not the side between the two congruent angles. So the way that we write this is crucial. All right, let's move on to the next one. Or before we do that, here if you see, we have these two angles are congruent. A is congruent to D, angle C is congruent to F, and they give us the side in between is congruent. So that allowed us to write a congruency statement of triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. All right, just make sure you have the corresponding parts that are congruent to each other are written in the same position in our statement. All right, the next one, angle, angle, side. So we first had side, 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 angle, side, where we know that this angle must be the angle that's between the two congruent sides. So it must be this angle here because the other ones are not between it. Then we had angle, side, angle, where we also talked about since S is written between the two angles, this side needs to be the congruent side between the two congruent angles. All right, if it's not in between them, we cannot use angle, side, angle. And this last one is angle, angle, side. So it's the exact same thing. We follow what is happening here. So that means if we have two triangles, and I give you that these two angles are congruent, then the side needs to correspond and needs to be congruent as well. So this one is important. If I say this side is congruent to this side, this is not angle, angle, side because this side is not in the same position as this one here. If you see here, this side is next to the one tick mark, while this side is next to the two arc marks. We go from 2 to 1, then our side. This one we go from 1 to 2, then our side. All right, so it's important that they match up exactly. So they need to correspond exactly with each other. So since this tick mark was here, in order for us to use angle, angle, side, it would have to be that side there. Or if we said this side is congruent to this side, we could still use angle, angle, side. All right, angle, angle, side. So in this case, we have multiple examples that we can use with this, but the only one that would not work is if they do not correspond, or if we tried to say this one here is congruent to this one here, since they don't match up with the angle, angle, side, where the side is after the two angles, then it does not work. All right, so here they give us angle A is congruent to D, C is congruent to F, and then they give us the exact same corresponding sides are congruent to each other, so we can say angle, angle, side, and then we can write our congruency statement. All right, I'm just going to go through, there's one more, and I'm going to go through some examples of what we need to look out for before we go and answer some problems. All right, so the first one that we did was side, side, side. The second one was side, angle, side. Then it was angle, side, angle, and angle, angle, side, in which the exact position that we wrote it in is the exact position that it needs to fall in on our triangles when we're saying that they're congruent. And the last one is our hypotenuse leg congruency theorem. All right, so this one is our hypotenuse leg, and it's exactly what it sounds like. First off, in order for us to have a hypotenuse, it needs to be a right triangle. If our triangles are not right triangles, then we cannot have a hypotenuse. So the first thing is we need to have a right triangle. Then we need to have our hypotenuses need to be congruent, and then our corresponding legs need to be congruent. All right, so as long as if we have our hypotenuse and our leg, then they are congruent. Now, if we try to say this one is congruent here, they're actually still going to be equal to each other and congruent because that just means that one of these triangles is flipped and rotated. So all we need is we need a right angle. Once we see we have a right angle, and this is the one that everyone forgets about because it's the only one that doesn't follow S and A. It has two completely different letters. So this is the only one that people forget about. So since it's a right angle, right away you should look, does HL work? Maybe it's not HL, maybe it's still one of these four, But everyone forgets about HL. So once it's a right angle, check and see, do I have a hypotenuse and do I have a leg that are congruent? And if I do, then they are congruent by HL. And here we see that we have two right angles, so C and F. And then we see our legs are congruent, our hypotenuses are congruent, so we can say the two triangles are congruent. We cannot say that this one is SSA or ASS. This one does not work. It only works when it is a right angle and when it's hypotenuse leg. If it's not a right angle, then we cannot have a sides that are congruent with an angle outside of it. It only works when it's a hypotenuse, so that means it's a right angle, and then this hypotenuse is congruent and the leg is congruent. Because remember, if this was A, B, and C, and this one's D, E, and F, well, here we would know that we have A squared plus B squared is equal to C squared. Here we have D squared plus E squared is equal to F squared. And since A is equal or congruent to D, we can substitute D in for here, so D squared. And since plus B squared is equal to, and since F is congruent to C, we can substitute F in here. And since we have the exact same numbers being squared and added to each other, that means that E squared will have to be congruent to B squared, 100%. All right, so this is the last one, HL. All right, so we're going to talk about one more thing, and then we're going to solve some questions. All right, what we need to just focus on is if I give you, say, side, angle, side, what we need, or no, that's not a good one. Let's say angle, side, angle. All right, what you need to make sure is that everything that I'm giving you is corresponding. So what I mean is if I say this angle is congruent to this angle, be aware, I could say this one here is congruent to this, and it needs to be exactly the same. So meaning the side needs to be between it. So just because we see that one of these has a side in between, since it's not identical to the one to the left because this one is not between the two angles, we cannot say that angle side angle is correct. All right, it needs to be identical. All right, one more I want to show you. And also, if we go to use angle, angle, side, I talked about this already, but if we have two triangles, all right, and we say that this angle is congruent to this angle, and this one's congruent to here, if I tell you that this is congruent to this, then this one is not angle, angle, side because they do not correspond. This congruent side does not correspond to this congruent side. So just make sure that both triangles are exactly the same and all of the congruent parts match up or correspond with each other. All right, so let's go ahead and do some examples real quick. All right, so for these ones, we're going to see, can we use side, 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 angle, side, angle, side, angle, 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 side, or HL to say that the two triangles are congruent? And if they are, then write a congruency statement. All right, so for this one here, we know that this angle has to be congruent to this angle because they're vertical angles, something we talked about in a couple videos before. So now we have side, angle, side, side, angle, side. So yes, they are congruent through side, angle, side. And my congruency statement, remember the first triangle, doesn't really matter how you write it, but triangle ABC, now we just need to make sure that we correspond. So in this case, we went A to B. So that means here I'm going to go E to D. So triangle E, D, C. All right, this one you have a little bit more freedom of how you want to write because these two sides are congruent. So you have a little bit more freedom of how you want to write this. All right, the next one, are these two congruent? Yes, because all three sides are congruent. So side, side, side. And same thing for this, since they're all the same, we can actually rotate this any way that we want. So I'm just going to go ahead and say triangle FGH is congruent to triangle JKL. All right, and then our last one, we only see these tick marks, but this is the exact same side in both of our triangles. So these are congruent to each other. So yes, by side, 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 these are all congruent. And this green side here, you need to know this in the future, it's going to be our reflexive property. Right? When we go to do proofs, that's something that we are actually use a lot when the same side is in both triangles. Right? Now, if we want to go ahead and write our congruency statement, we can then say triangle, I'm going to go MNP, so MNP is congruent to triangle. So we went through one tick mark through two. So I need to go through one, then through two. So triangle PQM. Right, there's a couple more examples, and then I'm just going to show you one quick screen that you can copy down, and that's it. Right here, there is no congruency statement we can write because there's no letters, so we're just determining, are these congruent? Yes or no, and if so, state the postulate or theorem. So this is the same side in both triangles, so we know that they're congruent. So here we have side, angle, side, side, angle, side. So yes, side, angle, side. Here, it's the same side in both triangles, so it's a reflexive property. So now, since we have a right angle, the first thing we should look is, do we have a hypotenuse that's congruent and a leg? Yes, both of these are hypotenuse, and here we have a leg that's congruent. So we would say yes, and it will be through HL. And then our last one, we have angle, angle, side, angle, angle, side. This congruent side corresponds, meaning that it's after the same arc mark, it's in the same position. So yes, and it will be angle, angle, side. All right, so you guys are then have one more thing I'm just going to show you. It's it for the video pretty much, because you can just pause this last part and take some more notes, and then we'll just go through a bunch of these in class. All right, I'm not going to go through all of these because we already did, but this is just a very good thing that you can copy down for your notes if you want to. All right, so you can pause this right now and just copy this down, but that's it for the video.